There's a photograph from May 2006 that most people have never seen. Dennis Bergkamp standing alone near the centre circle at Highbury, not celebrating, not waving, just looking. His shirt is untucked. His socks are rolled down. The stadium is emptying, but he hasn't moved. It's not the image Arsenal used for the farewell montages. It's not the one that made the back pages, but it's the one that explains him better than any of the others. Because while everyone else was performing the theatre of goodbye, Bergkamp was doing what he always did, standing still, watching, thinking, refusing to give you the moment you expected. The question isn't why he stayed on the pitch that night. The question is why, even at the end, he couldn't help but make you wait for it. To understand that photograph, you have to go back to what Bergkamp represented, not just at Arsenal, but in English football more broadly. When he arrived in the summer of 1995, the Premier League was still a place where technique was admired but not trusted, where flair was fine as long as it didn't get in the way of effort. Bergkamp didn't fit that template. He wasn't interested in running more than anyone else, or shouting louder, or playing the game the English way. He was interested in geometry, in the angle of a pass, in the weight of a touch, in the space between what defenders expected and what he actually did. And for a while that made him frustrating. His first season was patchy. There were moments of brilliance, but also long stretches where he seemed detached, almost disinterested. The tabloids called him a luxury player. Some fans wondered if he was worth the money. But then something shifted. Arsène Wenger arrived in 1996, and suddenly Bergkamp had a manager who understood that football could be played with the brain as much as the legs, who valued control over chaos, who saw beauty not as decoration but as function. And Bergkamp became the embodiment of that philosophy. The hat-trick against Leicester in 1997, where every goal was a different kind of perfect. The turn and finish against Newcastle in 2002, a piece of physics that shouldn't have worked but did because he understood time differently than everyone else on the pitch. The assist for Ljungberg against Juventus, a flick that rewrote the geometry of the entire attack in half a second. These weren't just highlights, they were arguments. They were proof that football could be something other than what English football had always insisted it should be. And the thing is, Bergkamp never sold it. He never campaigned for his own greatness. He gave interviews in a flat, almost monotone voice. He didn't do the post-match theatrics. He didn't wave to the cameras or kiss the badge with any real conviction. He just played, and then he left. And you were left to figure out what you'd just seen. That was the contract. He gave you the moment. You did the rest. And for a certain kind of fan, that was everything. It meant his legacy wasn't built on hype or narrative or the stories he told about himself. It was built on what actually happened on the pitch, on the things you could see if you were paying attention. But it also meant that when the end came, it was never going to be loud. It was never going to be a spectacle. It was going to be exactly what it was. A man standing alone in the centre circle, waiting for everyone else to finish performing so he could finally leave. The turning point, if you can call it that, wasn't a single match. It was a process, a slow fade that Bergkamp managed with the same precision he'd managed everything else. By the 2005-06 season, he was 36. His legs were gone in the way that matters for footballers. Not injured, just slower, less explosive, less able to do the things that had once come without thinking. Wenger had started rotating him more carefully, saving him for the matches that mattered, using him as a tactical weapon rather than a constant presence. And Bergkamp accepted it. There was no public complaint, no demand for more minutes, no attempt to prove he could still do what he'd done a decade earlier. He just adapted. He became a different kind of player, less involved in the build-up, more patient, waiting for the one moment per match where his intelligence could still change everything. And often it did. But the farewell itself, the final home match against Wigan on May 7th, was strange in the way that endings often are when the person leaving doesn't quite believe in the ceremony. Highbury was closing. Bergkamp was retiring. It was supposed to be emotional, cathartic, a perfect send-off for both the stadium and the man who had defined an era there. And on paper, it was. Arsenal won 4-2. Thierry Henry scored a hat-trick. Bergkamp came off in the 78th minute to a standing ovation that lasted longer than it should have, the kind of applause that becomes uncomfortable because no one knows when to stop. But if you watch the footage, Bergkamp looks almost embarrassed. He doesn't milk it. He doesn't raise his arms or blow kisses or do a lap of honour. He shakes a few hands, hugs Wenger, and walks off. And then, after the final whistle, after the speeches and the presentations and the choreographed celebrations, he stayed. Not at the front, not with the other players, but alone, near the centre circle, looking around like he was trying to memorise something he knew he'd forget. The cameras caught it for a few seconds, then moved on. Because it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't the story anyone wanted to tell. The story they wanted was the one where Bergkamp waved goodbye and everyone cried and it felt like closure. But Bergkamp had never given anyone the story they wanted. Why would he start now? What made that moment so perfectly him was the refusal to perform. The understanding that some things don't need to be explained or amplified or turned into content, that sometimes the most honest response to an ending is just to stand there and feel it, privately, without turning it into a spectacle for anyone else. And if that makes people uncomfortable, if it doesn't fit the script, then so be it. That was always the deal with Bergkamp. He gave you the football, everything else was his. The aftermath was predictable in some ways, strange in others. The tributes poured in as they always do. Former teammates called him a genius. Wenger said he was the most intelligent player he'd ever worked with. Fans made montages set to piano music. The media framed it as the end of an era, which it was, but also as the end of a certain kind of footballer, which felt more complicated. Because Bergkamp wasn't the last technical player or the last artist, or the last man to prioritise craft over athleticism. But he might have been the last one who was allowed to be that quiet about it, who could build a legacy almost entirely on what happened between the white lines without needing to construct a personality or a brand or a narrative around it. In the years that followed, the game changed in ways that made Bergkamp feel even more like a relic. Social media arrived. Players became content creators. Every goal, every assist, every training ground trick was immediately packaged and distributed and monetized. And the idea of a player like Bergkamp, someone who barely spoke, who didn't engage, who let the football do the talking, started to feel almost impossible. Not because the talent didn't exist, but because the infrastructure of modern football doesn't reward silence. It rewards noise. And Bergkamp had never been interested in noise. What's interesting is how his reputation has grown in the absence of that noise. There are players from his era who were more decorated, who won more trophies, who scored more goals. But Bergkamp is the one people keep coming back to. Not because he sold them on his greatness, but because he didn't. Because the memories are clean. There's no baggage, no controversy, no sense that he was performing his legacy for you. Just the football. Just the moments. And in an era where everything feels curated and calculated and designed to be remembered in a specific way, that purity has become more valuable, not less. Bergkamp himself has remained largely out of the spotlight. He coached for a while, mostly in the Netherlands, mostly in roles that didn't require him to be the face of anything. He's given a few interviews over the years, always in that same flat, almost reluctant tone, never trying to rewrite history or claim more credit than he deserves. In one interview, years after he retired, he was asked about that final night at Highbury, about why he stayed on the pitch after everyone else had left. And he said something like, "I just wanted to remember it, not for anyone else, just for me." Which is maybe the most Bergkamp answer possible. Because even at the end, even in the moment that was supposed to be about legacy and farewell and public memory, he was thinking about something private, something that couldn't be photographed or packaged or turned into a highlight reel. He was thinking about the feeling of standing on that pitch one last time, of seeing it from that angle, of holding on to something that would disappear the moment he walked away, and he didn't need you to understand it. He just needed to feel it. Looking back now, nearly 2 decades later, it's easier to see what made Bergkamp's goodbye so unusual. We live in an age of farewell tours, of retirement announcements timed for maximum engagement, of players controlling their own narratives down to the last Instagram post. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it makes Bergkamp's version feel almost radical in its restraint. He didn't tell you how to remember him, he didn't construct the story, he just left and trusted that the football would be enough. And for the most part, it has been. You see his influence now in the way people talk about certain players, the ones who make the game look like thought rather than effort, who seem to operate on a different frequency than everyone else. When someone describes a player as intelligent or elegant or a technician, They're often reaching for the same language that was used to describe Bergkamp, not because those players are copying him, but because he set a standard for what that kind of footballer could be in England, in a league that didn't always value it. And the fact that he did it without ever really asking for credit, without ever building a mythology around himself, makes the legacy feel more durable. Because it's not based on what he said or how he framed it, it's based on what people saw. And what they saw was someone who understood that football, at its best, is about moments that don't need explanation, about touches that rewrite the geometry of a match, about decisions made in fractions of seconds that change everything, about the gap between what seems possible and what actually is. Bergkamp spent his entire career living in that gap, and when he left, he did it the same way he played, quietly, precisely, without asking for permission or applause. Just a man standing alone in the centre circle, looking around one last time, holding on to something the rest of us will never fully understand. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the best legacies are the ones that don't need to be explained, the ones that just exist, clean and complete, waiting for you to notice them if you're paying attention. Do you remember watching him play or hearing about him from someone who did? I'd be curious to know what stayed with you.